If you're watching this, it means the censors haven't gotten to it yet, so watch it while you can. We're going over the 9 steps you need to take in order to write a good, entertaining, non-cringy spicy scene in your novel. Now, for obvious reasons, I can't put the text that we're going to talk about in this video, but if you click the link in the description, you can read the scenes that I'm talking about. And if you missed my video on the 9 disastrous mistakes that writers sometimes make with spicy scenes, make sure to watch that after this one. Now, the very first step to writing a good spicy scene is to go high concept. So what makes this particular romantic encounter different than the others? What sets it apart? Why is there a reason that this needs to appear in the book? It could be that this is the first time they're doing it with each other. It could be that they're very inexperienced and this is their first time either one of them are doing it, period. You could be breaking some sort of taboo, like there is an age difference, or maybe they are both married, but they are both married to other people. You could be having a divorced couple have one final fling. Maybe the reason for this spicy scene is in the middle of it, they need to have an argument. In one spicy scene in The Reluctant Fundamentalist, there's a scene where the male character says, okay, imagine that I'm your dead boyfriend, which is horribly emasculating, but somehow perfectly captures the tenor of their relationship to each other. Or Darren Strauss wrote this book called Chang and Eng, where basically it was 2 heads or 2 torsos connected to the same body, and one of them got married. And so the spicy scenes with the wife was very uncomfortable for the other person. My point is, whatever the high concept is for this particular spicy scene, you need to have that in mind before you start writing it to know why this deserves inclusion in your story. Now, the next step is foundational to all spicy scenes, and it's number 2. Remember that this is a relationship. Remember that lovemaking is about communication between your characters, and often the sex isn't just about sex. It's often accomplishing something for the storyline. So let's look at an example from Toni Morrison's novel, The Bluest Eye. First, there's a kind of unspoken desire. She doesn't want to open her legs, but she wants him to open them for her. 2, there's a kind of possessiveness in this scene. She wraps her legs around his back, and I think a normal writer when writing the scene would stop right there. But what Toni Morrison adds, which is so smart, so he can't get away. So she provides motivation for this character and a kind of possessiveness in her relationship. And there's also a kind of give and take in this relationship where she knows that he wants her to finish first, but instead she decides that she wants him to finish first. So there's this very complex relationship that's going on in the dynamic of this spicy scene. And little sidebar here, I know a lot of writers who publish their books and they just get crickets. There's no reviews, there's no readers. And at Bookfox, we decided to solve that problem by bringing on a publicist. Lauren is a fantastic publicist. She's gotten placements in stuff like Fortune Magazine and Today.com. And if you want to employ her to get the word out about your book, click the link to Bookfox Publicity in the description. The next step to writing a spicy scene helps it fit in with the rest of your book so it doesn't seem like an anomaly. It is number 3, propel your story. So let's apply the principle of Chekhov's gun to spicy scenes. The idea is if you show a spicy scene in your novel, it needs to have some sort of impact on the plot later on. So look at a book like George Orwell's 1984. This is a book where Smith has sex with Julia. But if you understand the context to this book, this is one where sex is very rigidly controlled. The state wants to destroy the nuclear family, and that even the act of having sex is a kind of revolt against the controlling authorities. So for Winston and Julia, having sex is an act of rebellion, and it impacts the plot because they might be persecuted or thrown in jail, or even worse for doing this. But in your book, think about a spicy scene as maybe starting a relationship, perhaps it leads to pregnancy, or perhaps it actually destroys a relationship or marks the end of a relationship. If you tie the spicy scene to your plot, then it won't seem gratuitous, it will seem like an essential building block in the entire narrative of your book. Now, the 4th step is absolutely unskippable if you really want to write a good spicy scene. It is naked character growth. Let me ask you, how does this particular spicy scene help the reader get to know the character better? Because if it's not building their character in some way, then it might be a candidate to be cut from the book. There's not really a strong purpose to keep it in the book. You can tell a lot about a character by how they act in bed. Let's look at a book by Stephen Macaulay called True Enough. So the first characterization here is that he's very shy. And so what does he do? He keeps the lights off and he keeps it under the covers, and he's almost embarrassed to be touching her. And the second characterization is a metaphor. He's basically a big puppy, but his size is at odds with how like immature and gawky and awkward he is. And the last way that we see this playing out is that he is very hesitant and he almost feels like it's disrespectful to be doing the things that they're doing. Honestly, a spicy scene might be the best way for a reader to feel like they're getting to know a character. There are things that happen behind the closed bedroom doors that are so intimate, it gives us this window into the very soul and character of this person. Beginning writers often forget about this next step to writing spicy scenes. It is number 5, emotions gone wild. One of the mistakes that I mentioned in my other spicy scenes video was Frankenstein actions. And what I meant by that is entirely focusing on the physical actions during a spicy scene. So when I say that instead you need to have emotions go wild, what I mean is you need to layer in thoughts and emotions into the scene alongside the physical actions. And for an example of this, let's look at On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwan. In this book, we have very inexperienced virgins on their wedding night, and it's going the way you would expect it to. But I'd like to point out that the entire scene is structured through the lens of her emotions. So first, she is masking her emotions. She is terrified, but she's hiding it because she wants the night to be a success. So she's putting up this, front of, oh, I'm calm, I'm calm. There's also disappointment, that she feels disappointed that he didn't touch her a little bit more, warm her up a little bit more. But then a little bit later, she gets this spike of happiness because she remembers she read this little guidebook that gave her the advice of, oh, I need to help guide him in. And a final sort of emotion that she feels during this scene is just astonishment. She has seen various anatomies on animals and just didn't know it actually fit on a human. So in this one spicy scene, we're going on this huge roller coaster ride of emotions that this character goes through, and that makes the scene much more complex and realistic than if we were just focusing on physical actions alone. Now this next step is probably the one that's the most fun. It is number 6, talk that tingles. Now we are not talking about the sort of cheesy, over-the-top dialogue that belongs inside the covers of a bodice-ripping novel. I remember Philip Roth has this line in Portnoy's Complaint where a young man is imagining things that a woman is screaming, things that no woman has ever screamed in bed, but he's fantasizing about these crazy things that she would say. No, what we're talking about in this step is how to have good dialogue, realistic dialogue, brilliant dialogue that takes place during a spicy scene, which isn't cliche or eye-rolling. There's a really interesting scene in Lauren Groff's Fate and Furies where a couple is coupling. Instead of saying anything about the sex, what she's doing is she's stroking his ego. She's saying to him, oh, you're such an amazing playwright. I can't believe how good you are. You're an absolute genius. And it is such a good way to bring ego into the bedroom and have that complement the actual physical actions that they're doing. There's also a book called White Palace by Glenn Savan. And it is about a couple who is experiencing infertility. So in the middle of them coupling, she pauses and just says, I wish we could have a baby. And it's such this tender, heart-rending moment. I think that's the use of dialogue to hit at one of their main character struggles in the novel during the act of sex. I think that uses dialogue really well to deflate the actual romanticism of the moment and make it more transactional. Like, we're trying to do this to have a goal, but it's not working. And then a third form of dialogue you should consider is non-cliched compliments. For instance, James Salter wrote one of the best spicy scene novels of all time, A Sport and a Pastime, and in it, he just has the young man say to the young woman, you have a wonderful profile. It's nothing to do with specific body parts. There's nothing rude about it or particularly sensual about it. It's just an honest, genuine compliment. So maybe think of compliments that aren't the most obvious ones when two characters don't have their clothes on with each other. The 7th step that every writer should think about when they're writing a spicy scene is to think beyond the bedroom. Look, it's perfectly fine to have a scene in a bed. Maybe that's what's appropriate for these particular characters in this particular story. But I'd like to encourage you that perhaps a more exotic setting might add something to the spicy scene. You might have read or watched the show Outlander, which was written by Diana Gabaldon. And in one scene in that book, there is a coupling that takes place in an open windowsill, and she is grabbing the edges to avoid falling out. It provides this wonderful element of physical danger to the scene. Or John Casey in Spartina, they end up making love on a riverbank. Or there's this 90s movie called 11:14 where something happens at 11:14 to a whole bunch of characters. In there, they're actually, doing it in a graveyard. Or James S.A. Corey wrote The Expanse, and so they're in space and they get to experience zero gravity coupling. Now, there are several advantages to getting out of the bedroom and exploring new scenes like this. One is that public settings have an additional layer of tension or danger to them. Two, you can use the scene in some way, the way that a fight scene often uses stuff around it and incorporates it into the fight. You can also do that with a spicy scene. However, there is danger to this principle. There are some locations where if you pick, it's going to be too far-fetched, and if they're doing it on a hot air balloon or something, you might get some readers rolling their eyes. I also think there is a little bit of a danger with the perfectly timed environmental factor. Just as they climax, there's a thunder cap, or the waves really crash in or something like that. You want to be wary of those environmental factors syncing up just a little too perfectly. The 8th step to writing a really good spicy scene is unconventional desires. So this is really a matter of knowing who your characters are and then also knowing who your readers are. Because arousal doesn't take the same shape for all characters, right? What turns on one character might not be nice for another character. And also, you have to know your readers' expectations and desires for what they might actually enjoy seeing on the page. I guess my overall point is don't assume that your character's sexuality has to match what's normal or accepted. In a book called Normal People, written by Sally Rooney, there is a spicy scene where the girl asks the boy to hit her, and he declines. But why does she want that? It's because she always saw her dad abusing her mom, and she sort of internalized that and is wanting those sort of abusive relationships. Another example would be from Paulo Coelho, who wrote 11 Minutes. You might know him because you read The Alchemist, but he has a book in which a woman who has never been able to have an O, but when she gets into BDSM, suddenly she can actually do it. My point is that you need to explore for your character what their desire is in the bedroom and don't feel constrained by conventional morals or expectations. And the last step of this whole spicy scene process is number 9, the power of suggestion. On one end of the spectrum, you have fade to black, which is where you don't show any of the spicy scene at all. You just have the bedroom door closed and the reader doesn't get to see it. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have very explicit scenes where you're showing everything that's going on. However, there is an option somewhere in the middle. I would call it the suggestive option. This is an option where you only allude to what's going on, but you don't spell it out explicitly. And honestly, this is something that books can do much better than movies can do. Let's look at Peter Carey's The Tax Inspector. In this scene, he keeps on saying oh, what if I try this? What if I try this? We don't know specifically what he's doing, but we can imagine. That's how you write a spicy scene, so it appears on the page, but in a very PG rated way. And you have to know your audience. You have to know whether that sort of suggestive scene is going to be right for them, whether they're going to be disappointed, or whether they think, that's just about right for these two characters. If you need help with publicity, click the Bookfox publicity link below. And also, if you haven't yet watched the 9 mistakes with spicy scenes video, watch that now.